I will now ask our next speaker, Chandrika Karunaratna. And Chandrika is a team leader from the United Nations Development Program that's based out in the office in Sri Lanka. And among other programs that she has worked on is a joint UN program on prevention and combating of human trafficking. And I think she has been also involved in some work around the National Authority for the Protection of Victims of Crime and Witnesses. I'm particularly interested to hear on this one and the linkages that it may have to trafficking. But your question, Chandrika, here is maybe to just walk us through what are the strategies that UNDP has in addressing the vulnerability of migrant workers to being trafficked into exploitative labor. So here we're talking forced labor. And could you also tell us a bit more about how the implementation of the strategies can be further improved? Over to you, Chandrika, you're welcome.
Thanks, Paddy. I'm going to frame my question a little bit broadly. What I'll focus on is mainly on the alternative sort of mechanisms and remedies to protect and assist victims of trafficking in the absence of specific laws and regulations to combat trafficking, or where such measures or laws aren't effectively used. And in that process, I will also speak on what UNDP has been doing within this broader scheme of things. So firstly, most countries in our region and across the globe have, over the past 2 decades, introduced specific legal provisions to sort of combat trafficking by explicitly criminalizing it, imposing severe sentences for offenders. But what has actually been the challenge? If we do have all of these laws, if we do have all of these regulations on paper, what has been the challenge? It's the effective enforcement of these provisions that have actually been the challenge. And one of the challenges for the effective prosecution, investigation of these offenders is also, the challenges associated with obtaining evidence required to prove coercion or deception or fraud, which are the essential elements of trafficking. And also the ease of charging offenders under other ancillary sort of penal provisions, such as, for example, procuration or other sexual offenses. And also the use of the definitions of smuggling, the use of the term smuggling and trafficking interchangeably. This has also led to significant challenges in movement against trafficking in persons. But one of the most important factors is also the absence of the limited reporting by victims of trafficking or even witnesses due to a fear of reprisals or sort of limited access to judicial mechanisms. For example, if you take an international domestic migrant worker who has been trafficked, whose passport has been withheld or confiscated, whose movements have been restricted, she would not have an opportunity to even approach any kind of legal organization or the police or law enforcement for that matter. And purely by being a trafficked victim, she would be contravening the immigration laws of a particular country, extended her stay beyond the permissible time frame. And also victims generally, because of a lack of appreciation or understanding of the gravity of the offense or the fact that trafficking is in fact a heinous offense. Now, against this backdrop, and against the COVID pandemic backdrop in particular, the vulnerabilities have sort of exacerbated. And even if laws exist, enforcement authorities are unable to, or rather they're paralyzed and they're unable to effectively intervene because of COVID-related safety imperatives and distancing protocols and travel bans and so on. So it's been harder to detect like some of these illicit activities and provide the direct assistance to vulnerable communities, especially during lockdown and social distancing. And there is also a risk of prolonged exploitation, including in forced labor conditions or sexual exploitation conditions, especially because the offender knows that the potential to be detected are very slim under these circumstances, where law enforcement is not able to effectively carry out investigations and operations. So they could exploit that situation further. And also the government's sort of response to victims with increased risk is also minimal within this context. So where the formal process, where the specific trafficking legislation is not proving effective, it's important, or rather I would say critical, to explore alternate provisions or mechanisms for assisting and protecting victims of trafficking. And especially where perhaps even law enforcement demonstrates a reluctance to pursue action as per the specific trafficking provisions. So what would be an alternate way to persuade sort of law enforcement to take action, to investigate, prosecute, and protect, identify, protect, and assist victims? And this is also one of the key areas in which UNDP is intervening. I lead the justice sector program at UNDP, and we have a very vibrant program on victim and witness protection. And that looks at victim and witness protection in total, looking at all types of victims of crime, including victims of trafficking. And so how can we do this? We can look at one approach that I am suggesting, which I also find proving effective in the Sri Lankan context, is the sort of recognition given to the protection and assistance to victims of crime and witnesses in general. So how can we make the case, or what would be our strategy to ensure that the broad acceptance of the general victim and witness protection mechanism can be tailor-made to cater to the needs of victims of trafficking? So given that victim and witness protection is critical to the effective functioning of a criminal justice system as a whole, and it's an essential component of case flow within the penal chain, what perhaps can be done is to demonstrate the importance of recognizing the rights and the entitlements of victims and position trafficked victims within this broader framework of victims of crime. And also illustrate the aggravated circumstances surrounding the case of a victim of trafficking. For example, if you bring to bear the concept of deception, coercion, and so on and so forth. So as an example, if a particular offender refuses to release a victim, threatens the particular victim of trafficking, and through a menace of penalty, and that sort of discourages the victim from reporting the offense, that can be, we could suggest that it be construed as obstructing the course of justice. And that would in turn recognize it as an aggravated offense. So that can be one of the ways in which an alternative mechanism can be brought to bear to ensure that victims of trafficking deserve and do get the due recognition and attention that they require. And especially because it's a two-pronged approach. You penalize the offender and you bring the offender to task, as well as you go into detail into the specific protection and assistance requirements of a victim or a witness. And for example, take for example a sexual offense. Sexual offenses are recognized as ordinary offenses, right? But if it deals with sexual exploitation of a trafficked victim and that trafficked victim is prevented from reporting the case, then we could argue that it sort of creates an aggravated circumstance. And this sort of broad framework of protection and assistance is there before, during, and post trial as well. So you sort of can ensure the continued assistance and continued provision of assistance to victims and witnesses. For example, medical care. It can be physical, psychosocial support, protection for the individual if the particular victim is afraid of reprisals. And also, for example, this is where civil society organizations, legal professionals, and medical professionals can support victims in developing or drafting the victim impact statement. and where the impact of the crime is illustrated, the physical impact, the psychological impact, the financial impact on the victim of crime, or on the traffic victim, could be presented to court, and enhanced compensation can be secured for that victim depending on the impact of that particular the offense. I won't go into detail, any more detail right now, because I'm also mindful of the time. But I just want to highlight one example, which I think is quite relevant in this context as well. This is actually a finding based on a study of the legal mechanisms available for Sri Lankan trafficked migrant workers in Jordan, which I undertook a few years ago. If a victim of trafficking is identified, and with some support, governmental support or any support from a organization, a civil society organization in that particular country, the victim is repatriated back to the country. Because in most cases, victims do want to immediately return to the country, given the traumatic experience they've gone through. Once the victim has been repatriated to the country, and if a particular organization has undertaken the legal case and has been going to court in that destination country on behalf of the victim, and the court awards back wages for the victim, and if the victim has returned to her country of origin, there has to be some sort of mechanism where these organizations could liaise with a particular legal aid organization in the country of origin of that victim, and ensure that whatever the victim has secured through court intervention actually reaches the victim. So this was something that was identified as a dire sort of need, and against this whole backdrop where a large number of migrants are repatriated, some of whom who have been repatriated could be victims of trafficking, and I'm sure there's a large percentage who are not even reflected in the number because of the hidden nature of this sort of offense. So it's very important to look at partnerships, memoranda of understanding between legal aid organizations in countries of origin and the destination countries, to sort of look at how victims can be protected and assisted even after repatriation. And once a traffic victim has returned back to the country, it doesn't simply end there. It doesn't end with the repatriation. The reintegration aspect of it should also be looked at in a sort of holistic manner. So you need to look at alternative means of livelihood for those individuals, and look at the push and pull factors of trafficking to sort of ensure there is a holistic approach to preventing trafficking. Paddy, how am I on time? Can I go into one other point, or do you want me to?
You can go into one other point. Thank you, Chandrika.
Okay, thanks. So one point that I wanted to make was also the importance of not looking at the different objectives, the GCM objectives, in a siloed approach. And I think we all know this also, because the objectives are interlinked. So for example, it's important to the point I'm trying to make, the fact that limited reporting of the offense of trafficking is not an indication that the problem doesn't exist. We all know that. And so while we enunciate the importance of basing policy decisions on established data and evidence, we should not go by the number of reported cases, because that would not provide a sound and sort of empirical base on which to build policy. And objective one is about the collation and utilization of data as a basis for evidence-based policies. And here I wanted to mention that the emphasis should be on the accurate data and evidence on which we base policies and laws and regulations. So it's important to penetrate beyond the general reported cases to ascertain the actual magnitude of the sort of situation. So that's it. That's about all I want to sort of introduce at this point. I will go into some of the other points during our discussion. Thanks, Paddy.
Thank you, Chandrika. Very interesting to hear about, you know, sort of this alternative way of looking at, you know, when the prevailing situation doesn't allow us, you know, I think this is where you're coming from, that when the prevailing situation doesn't allow us to have effective enforcement, what else can we do? You know, what else can we do beyond us saying we're waiting for legal, you know, for legal provisions to be available, for the right frameworks, for the right structures to be available? But what else can we do in the meantime? And I think I really like the presentation that you have made in sort of looking at these alternative provisions that really go from identification, investigation, and it seems as well into prosecution. So I wanted to understand a bit what would happen around the areas of prosecution. Maybe you can dive into one of the examples. I know you didn't want to sort of go into it for a little bit too long, but you know, if it's possible to just dive in a little bit into that. And I wanted here to also point out the role that you have mentioned in terms of civil society being able to still provide, you know, the necessary requirements that victims need, even in the process of identification, even in the process of probably repatriation being organized and reintegration, and what the role of the sending country would have. So how far across would you stretch this sort of alternative route that we're looking at in terms of, you know, providing for the victim of trafficking in the meantime while we're sorting out sort of on the more structural basis? So I think we can come back to you on that. I think it's an interesting way of bringing out this sort of tailor-made situation, tailor-made alternative, because it is true that different cases of trafficking can be looked at also with different mirrors. I'm reminded with investigators of trafficking cases, and how just the perspective of exploitation was looked at by looking at a bed, you know, where some felt that two or four people sleeping in one room was a maltreatment of these migrant workers in this case, and another thought that at least they were four, they had a window, they had a door to it, and they even had their own shower and bathroom. So that somehow, sometimes also looking at it into the intricate details when we talk about, you know, trafficking, and when evidence is being brought out, and when the scenario is being looked at, is important. I liked your point also on data and how important that is. And I think in also looking at alternative sources where we can try to track where, you know, potential cases of trafficking could be. I think there was an interesting research a couple of years ago from Canada that showed how just receipts, or was it bank account deposits, were an important way of tracking victims of trafficking. So, you know, how do we bring in all these other methods? And all these are stipulated, you're right, in the GCM, and quite interconnected in a way, and requiring across the board cooperation, not just across the border, but across the board as governments, civil society, and also working together with other partners. So thank you for that.